Well, welcome to everybody. I'm really excited for the chance to hear Melanie again. She gave a stupendous presentation at the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness meeting this summer, and I think we all benefited, and I want to see if I can't improve what I learned then. I don't think we're going to end up being able to persuade Kamala or AOC or the other members of the squad, but I think we can do a lot better with the persuadables that might be willing to listen to our message if we approach them in a positive way. Melanie Sturm has an MBA, and her undergraduate degrees are in international relations and economics. She has worked in the finance industry with the International Finance Corporation, with Morgan Stanley and Drexel Burnham Lambert, and has trained all kinds of people, from political candidates to government officials to corporate executives to policy analysts and people like us. So Melanie, welcome, and thank you so much for being back with us.
And thank you, Dr. Orient, for the kind introduction. And I must say, having talked to you after my last presentation at DDP, I found you to be a quick study, just as I expect the other doctors on this webcast to be as well. You're all used to probably being the smartest people in the room. And one of the things that points that I like to make is that's not always the key to changing people's minds, having the best data or arguments or facts. And that's where the 6 powers of persuasion came from. And someone actually at the DDP conference after I presented came up to me and said, really what you're teaching is how to talk with emotional IQ, or in the parlance of doctors, speaking with a good bedside manner. So maybe that's really what the 6 powers of persuasion are about. And therefore they have broad utility, well beyond advocating for policies, certainly in your professional life and even in family. I've been asked to do this at churches, to help with comedy in churches. So anyway, as Jeremy said, tonight's webcast is really designed to present to you the principles, the 6 powers of persuasion. Next week, we'll be workshopping them. And in the interim, whether it be tonight in the middle of this presentation or between now and next week, you can write in the Q&A some of the questions or the most vexing issues that you would most like to address or most like to have help with. What are the policy ideas that you'd most like to advance? And I can develop a handout between now and next Thursday, and it can inform our discussion next Thursday. So before beginning on the topic of handouts, you were sent before tonight, actually 5 handouts. So the first one is 6 powers of persuasion. I'm just gonna, I don't know if you can even see that, hold it up. Mark Twain said, if I had more time, I could have written something shorter. I've had since 2011 to be thinking about this. Yeah, my background's finance, but it was in 2010 that I was writing op-eds, counterpoints really, on the opinion page of the Aspen Times, and then went on to write a column, which I'll tell you that backstory in a moment. So I've had lots of time, and I developed these 6 powers of persuasion, which are all that I've learned over the last, almost decade, condensed into these 6 powers of persuasion. Normally when I make my own handouts, I put on the back of the 6 powers another handout that I really developed this handout as I was doing workshops before the election. Someone had sent me an email, a guy who sends really good emails, and it was, I'm not voting for Trump, I'm actually voting for these things. And if you've got the handout, you can see I'm voting for the Second Amendment, the next Supreme Court Justice, the Electoral College, etc. And that's typical of conservatives, is we have a tendency to fight for things instead of people. That's why the 3rd power of persuasion is the winning side always fights for people, not things. So I took his little email and I amended it, writing in italics the things, what those things actually did for people. So hopefully that's helpful to you. The next handout is the Start with Whys handout that it includes some whys. I call them whys. They're gentle conversation starters that you can use to engage persuadables or power down hostiles. And I always encourage people to be careful about powering down hostels. I'm glad Dr. Orient spoke about someone like Kamala Harris not being a persuadable, being a hostile. I generally recommend not even trying to engage a hostile because they're not convertible, but you can power them down. And that does have utility when you're in the presence of a persuadable, because if you do it right, the persuadable will be drawn to you and repelled by the hostility of the hostile. So this WISE handout, and we're going to be going over this mid presentation, what is a why, but it's essentially saying something that articulates what someone already believes. And so it's an easy way to get into a conversation. And then the next handout is the persuasive messaging. It's a handout that I had developed for a panel I was on how to talk to millennials about socialism. And since one of the persuasive messaging topics was Medicare for all, hopefully that will be useful to you. Then the last handout was something that I developed by popular demand. Before the election, I had so many people asking me for examples of how to power down a hostile. As I said, I generally recommend not doing it, but if they're in your family or if it's a dear friend, you have to do it. And so this handout has two examples. A friend of mine whose daughter was a hostile and another friend whose dear friend was a hostile. And I helped them write their responses to them. And then what is at the top of that was, I don't go on social media much. I find it very irritating, but I went on to wish someone a happy birthday and saw this obnoxious thing at the top. And then I decided to respond. So with that, now you know what the handouts are. I want to just explain the title, the name of Engage to Win that's on your screen right now. A lot of people look at it and think it's about winning talking points or debates. Politicians thinks it's about winning elections, but really what it's about is winning a better future for humanity by winning people over to the ideas that they instinctively agree with. They just don't know it yet. And you'll understand why in a moment. I learned this in writing a column. And just to give you the backstory on that, how a finance person like me is now in the business of teaching and writing persuasive messaging. In 2010, I mentioned I was writing op-eds before the 2012 election on the opinion page, these counterpoints. And about 6 months later, the editor of the Aspen Times, where I live, came to me and asked if I would help him diversify the opinion page. And I joke, it's not because he needed a woman or a woman or a Jew. And I was really scared to write an opinion column. I was worried about being the scourge of Aspen, but I agreed to do it. Launching the column, I titled it, "Think Again, You Might Change Your Mind." And the idea was I wasn't going to parrot talking points. I wanted to expose people to unconsidered arguments and facts in order to create a more informed and thoughtful citizenry, which is, after all, essential for a free and fair society. And so I launched my column, seeking out the best, masters of communication, from Dale Carnegie to Stephen Covey to Simon Sinek, putting some of my own ideas into it. And what I discovered is that not only would people think again, they often change their mind if I approach them the right way. And the most surprising thing of all was that I wasn't perceived as a conservative. And so just as I worked very hard to be readable, we're going to talk today about how to be more hearable, because it's not what we say, it's what people hear. And so with that, I'm going to start. I'm going to go into the first slide here, but I have a joke, because one of the powers of persuasion, find the common ground, the first power of persuasion is designed to make yourself be more likable by using humor. I'm going to start with a joke, and it's a joke about a Jewish mother. I'm one, so I can tell this joke. And Sorry, I got a new Apple Watch and it's ringing. So anyway, the joke. So this young man comes home to his mother and says, "I've fallen in love and I'd like you to meet the young lady. But I want to try a little test. I want to bring 3 women home to meet you, and I want to see if you can figure out which one of the 3 it is that I've fallen in love with." So the mother agrees, and he brings the 3 ladies to meet her, and they're all chatting. And he interrupts. He says, "Okay, Mom, have you figured out which one it is that I've fallen in love with?" And the mother says, "Yeah, yes, I have. The one on the right." And the young man says, "That's amazing, Mom. How'd you know?" And the mother says, "I don't like her." So I don't get the same audience reaction that I'm used to here. I hope you found it funny.
That was a good one. That was a good one.
Okay, good. So I'm here as a Jewish mother to say that is an unfair stereotype, just as this is an unfair stereotype, that we are uncaring, bigoted extremists. And suffice it to say, this is the stereotype that we labor under, not only because we're cast this way, because we're up against these false narratives, but it's also our own inartfulness. And as a consequence, this is a meme that came off of a Facebook post of a friend of mine. Why should millennials ever listen to a conservative if we're against the things that they're for, from, marrying who you love, healthcare for all, children eating? I won't read all this stuff, but suffice it to say that worse than not persuading is speaking in a way that entrenches these misperceptions of us. You can see here, this is a Pew tracking poll that looks at the different generations of Americans. And you can see here how younger generations with regard, I'm focusing in on government because that's what we're most worried about, government control of healthcare. You can see the younger the American, the more inclined they are to believe that government should do more to solve our problems. So that's why I always like to begin by checking in with my audience to make sure that you agree with my premise. I can't see you. I'm going to assume that you agree. I checked this out with Jeremy before, but my hunch is that you agree with premise number 1, that our ideas and values and principles, I call them Americanism, and you're going to see a list of them in a moment, that they're actually the best for the most people, especially the most vulnerable, especially the most vulnerable. And that progressivism actually devastates the very people that it purports to help, especially the most vulnerable. But for some reason, progressives get to coast on their benign intentions above the wreckage of their policies. They're the kind-hearted and we're the black-hearted. And normally I like to tease out of the audience why that is so, why that unfair circumstance is so. And most people like to point the finger at others, whether it's the media or the education system. I like to point the thumb at us and invoke that line from the movie Cool Hand Luke. What we've got here is a failure to communicate. And that's what this workshop is about. That's what the 6 powers of persuasion are designed to do, is to help us communicate more persuasively and winsomely. No doubt about it, we're up against a toxic political environment. Yes, arrayed against us is academia, from kindergarten all the way up through grad school, probably in medical school. I know now too, having been at DTP and having seen a very powerful presentation. I got a 17-year-old who's in high school right now. I know what's going on there. Of course, late night comics, Hollywood, and of course, media and social media. That we have widespread civic ignorance. As Abraham Lincoln said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. And we see that having spilled out into the streets this summer, and you see it in that tracking poll. Kids now view government as being more the answer than in older generations, because we were taught differently. And so the main point I want to make here, though, is that despite all these factors, these exogenous factors, that we are held to a higher standard and we must perform at a higher standard. So at one of our first workshops, engaged to win workshops, we had Arthur Brooks, who was then the president of the American Enterprise Institute. And I just have a few outtakes from that presentation. I'm going to start with this one.
We don't need a fundamental change in values. On the contrary, our values are correct. Our worldview is right, but we need to talk differently. We have to talk in the way that shows that we are willing to fight for people more than the other guys. Until we do that, we're not going to succeed in our message, and people are simply not going to be drawn to us. That's what I hope to share with you today. How long does it take people to figure you out? Somebody doesn't know you. You're in a debate, you're giving a speech, you're having a conversation, whatever. How long does it take people to figure out you? The answer is 7 seconds. People will assess who you are and what your message is all about. They'll sum you up. They'll put you in a frame in 7 seconds. What are you going to do? The answer is, if you want to win, you better be in charge of your 7 seconds.
So how can we be in charge of our 7 seconds? This truism, Teddy Roosevelt, I think, first said it. I've also heard Jack Kemp may have said it or gotten it from Teddy Roosevelt. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I always tell people, if you can remember nothing else from this presentation, please remember this truism. The first power of persuasion, you are the message, is this idea that before you even open your mouth, nonverbal communication cues allow you to make people more inclined to like you and to think that you care. We're going to talk about that when we get to the 6 powers of persuasion. So one of the things you want to most be focused on is trying to show that you care. So Democrats care. This was a recent tweet by Joe Biden. My message to everyone struggling right now is this: help is on the way. I love the response of Governor Kristi Noem. She invoked Reagan, there you go again, when he said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, those being the most terrifying words in the English language. Here you see, these are some tweets from before the election. Kamala Harris talking about how folks are trying to make ends meet while Republicans are prioritizing a Supreme Court nominee that will strike down the Affordable Care Act. And then you have Nancy Pelosi talking about fighting for food for hungry families and other things there. Meanwhile, Republicans have a tendency to talk about money. These are tweets, they were coming out daily through October and November about how much money is left in the PPP funds and how many times the Republicans have tried to release it. Now, here's a case study that messaging matters and showing empathy matters. Andrew Cuomo, Governor Andrew Cuomo's job approval rating hit an all-time high this summer, despite the fact that he was probably the worst governor in terms of deaths from COVID, having made the decision to send COVID-afflicted people back into nursing homes. So the point here, when I first started writing my column, I figured I've got the winning arguments. All I have to do is write them well and I'll win the support. That was Margaret Thatcher's idea, but I soon realized not so fast. First, I had to win the trust of the people that I was trying to persuade. And once I did that, then my winning arguments could win their support after they were willing to read me. And so oftentimes when I work with audiences, especially with politicians, they know their talking points. They know superficially why our ideas are superior, but I just want to go through and cement this. It's one of the things I learned in writing a column. And let's start here. This is that list of the shared American heritage, the values, frankly, that most of which we were founded on. I call this Americanism. And the reason why they garner widespread support, not that there aren't people who aren't actively trying to undermine these things, we all know that they are, especially in this last election, but the vast majority of people support these and Americanism because they know that each one has helped assure a free and fair society and the most prosperous, decent, fair society in human history. Now, I've given a talk back when I was writing my column. I would give a talk called "Think There's No Common Ground in Our Politically Polarized Era?" ? Think again. And the first time I gave the talk was in Boulder, Colorado. And I put a slide like this up asking the audience if they agreed with these values. And I got some pushback then on one, just as I have since, always the same one. And I'm just going to tell you the one that it is In God We Trust. You were probably guessing. And when I framed it in terms of fairness, which is power of persuasion number 4, you frame issues in terms of fairness, then you can reach everyone. People got it. So the way I explained it is I said that it's this idea that derives from our Declaration of Independence, that we're all endowed by our Creator with these natural rights, these inalienable rights. Not a single dictator, president, king, aristocrat gives us our rights, nor can they ever take them away. And even people in Boulder got that. So you can see here that because majorities believe in these founding ideas, even Democrats, that Nancy Pelosi, before she began the impeachment hearings last December, she said the Pledge of Allegiance. In the mayor of Seattle invoked patriotism in talking about that autonomous zone that was there and the whole Black Lives Matter organization. And so here's really why Americanism is the morally superior formula for humanity. It's a chart that depicts essentially prosperity, human well-being as measured by GDP per capita, going back to the time of Jesus. And you can see here that for time immemorial, that poverty was the natural state that people were born into and frankly died into. There was very little social mobility. And as Thomas Hobbes put it in the 17th century, that life was nasty, brutish, and short for the vast majority of people. But you see, after the Enlightenment and the creation of the United States, that the proverbial hockey stick comes to fore, where you see prosperity measured as GDP per capita just skyrockets, not only in the United States, but frankly, any other country since then where elements of Americanism have been tried. You see here that as as economic growth has increased, world poverty, extreme world poverty, has declined. And here you can see since the 1990s, when at the end of the Soviet Union, the other metrics of human well-being since communism failed have also improved: hunger, poverty, illiteracy, child mortality, even pollution. So I'm going to play this just to cement this idea of why economic freedom actually improves people's lives.
Imagine you had to live in a country from one of these two lists for the rest of your life. Which list would you choose? If you're like most people, you would choose A. Let's take a look at why that is. Take Chile and Venezuela. Chile's poverty rate is half that of Venezuela's, and its inflation rate is a fraction of the size. Actually, all of List A appears to be better off than B. Look at income per person. It's 10 times higher on average in List A. But these lists aren't organized by income. They're organized by economic freedom. List A countries have the most free economies in the world. List B, the least free. Across the globe, we see a strong relationship between economic freedom and people's quality of life. For instance, people in the most free countries earn, on average, over 8 times more than people in the least free. The poor earn 10 times more. People in the most free countries are happier. They have better protected civil rights, cleaner environments, and the average person lives 20 years longer. The freest countries also have less corruption, less infant mortality, less child labor, and less unemployment. So if you care about improving people's lives, then you really care about economic freedom. And having economic freedom means your property is protected under an impartial rule of law. You're free to trade with others for what you need and want. Your money keeps its value because your national currency is stable. And government stays small relative to the size of the economy. For years, the U.S. was among the world leaders in economic freedom. But over the last decade, the U.S.'s ranking fell, and it's projected to keep falling. The question is, will our quality of life fall with it?
Good news is that was done in 2015. So since then, the economic freedom rating for the United States has gone way up. Okay, so now let's talk about what is persuasion. Normally, I like to tease this out of the audience. The punchline here is, if you want to pick up a bullhorn and project your voice with authority and influence people with it and have it reach far and wide, you have to have credibility, which comes from being trustworthy. And that's something that you have to earn by being likable. And that's what these 6 powers of persuasion are designed to help you be. You can see here, doctors like you, trusted relationship, probably the most trusted relationship of all, were used in the 50s and 60s actually to sell cigarettes. And so here's the problem, that we are living in this era of where people are living in thought silos or cultural echo chambers, where they are fed by social media's what I call curated tribalism. You follow only those people who confirm your bias and defriend or unfollow those that don't. And so as a consequence, we're losing this moral consensus that I just talked about, on which we were founded. And we have a tendency to talk only in ways that resonate with people in our tribe. And our goal is to reach beyond our tribe into the other tribe, meeting people where they are, speaking to them in ways that they can hear us. And we do that by making ourselves hearable. And this is not the way to be hearable. Wagging your finger, telling people, lecturing people. It's really a silly notion that anyone would ever change their mind if you're talking and not listening to them, and not letting them talk or express themselves. People will tune out and turn off, and no minds will be changed. And Stephen Covey had it right when he said, most people don't listen with the intent to understand, they actually listen with the intent to reply. And we have to flip that script. This is the second power of persuasion. One of the ways to find the common ground is to be an engaged listener and to try to understand what other people's concerns are so that we can validate them. And I'll be giving you some examples as we go. So let's just spend a few moments talking about how not to persuade. This is a meme my then 16-year-old son, or he might have been 15 at that point, shared on social media. I always tell people, don't bash other people's political identity. In my column, I actually didn't even mention the word Democrat or Republican, or even any, I didn't name any politicians either until about a year and a half later, right before the 2012 election. And when I did, I really got hammered in the letters to the editor. Big lesson. So what I recommend, instead of using labels like California Democrats, just say what they are, just say what they believe, just say people, that people who allow other people to be here illegally are putting their interests before everyone else, including homeless citizens who are perhaps our most vulnerable. And that's not fair. So you're going to hear this fairness theme coming back a lot. So here's probably the biggest example of a gaffe. Romney really cast himself as uncaring when he said that it wasn't his job to be responsible for the 47% of Americans who were dependent, entitled victims. And this had huge consequences. You can see here in the exit polls, 2012 exit polls, on these 3 out of the 4 qualities, vision, values, and leadership, Romney trounced Obama. But on this all-important, who cares about people like me, you can see that Obama trounced Romney 81-18. And that means that there are people who voted for Romney who thought that Republicans who voted for Romney thought that Obama cared more about them than Romney, which is quite astonishing. So here is a little outtake from a debate that took place in Georgia in 2017 when Tom Price joined the Trump administration. He had just won in 2016 by 23 points in this district. Newt Gingrich had won it previously and held it by like 40 points. And so the guy who was running for the seat, the Democrat, his name is Jon Ossoff. He's actually the same guy who's running in the Senate runoff right now against Purdue, Senator Purdue, and young, articulate guy. And he was running against a woman named Karen Handel. And Karen, I'm just going to tell you because I can't tease this out of you. We can't discuss it. But no, I've shown this video before telling people it's not a good example of how to make a good argument. And people who watch it, because they're in the choir, they think she does a good job because she's fighting for business. When asked the question, do you support an increase in the minimum wage? You're going to hear her fight for business. And in essence, she makes the same mistake that Mitt Romney made in 2012, talking always about job creators and entrepreneurs and business. And so two-time Obama voters, so in other words, people who didn't vote for Romney later voted for Trump because they thought Trump had their back. Had his back, the way they thought Trump had their back, where they thought Romney had the back of their boss. And so I'm going to show you the video of the short outtake of how they both answer this question. I normally like to have someone volunteer to answer it themselves. But we can't do that in this format. So I'm going to show you how they respond to this question, and then I'm going to role model how to do it using the 6 powers of persuasion. So here goes. Here's the short outtake.
Does either candidate support a minimum wage increase? Mr. Ossoff, starts with you.
Yes, I do. The minimum wage should be a living wage. I think we can raise it indexed to the cost of living because the cost of living varies widely in urban and rural areas and in different states across this country. I think that increase needs to be implemented at a pace that allows business owners to adapt their business plans so they're not shocked. Their business plans are not shocked by a sudden increase in labor costs. But look, if someone's working a 40-hour work week, they deserve the kind of standard of living that Americans expect. That's part of the American dream, and there are too many folks who are having trouble making ends meet.
Minimum wage.
This is an example of the fundamental difference between a liberal and a conservative. I do not support a livable wage. What I support is making sure that we have an economy that is robust with low taxes and less regulation so that those small businesses that would be dramatically hurt if you impose higher minimum wages on them are able to do what they do best, grow jobs and create good paying jobs for people in the 6th district.
Normally when I've got an audience in front of me, I can see the groans and the, oh gosh, I can't believe she said that. So I don't know that you had that reaction. I hope you did. When she came out of the box, instead of finding the common ground, she was divisive by saying this is the difference between liberals and conservatives, and then went on to say that she doesn't support a livable wage. I mean, that's the opposite of a why. And so I'm going to and then after this, it went viral. I live in Colorado, and I saw it on my Twitter feed. By the way, I always forget to say this. Karen Handel went on to win this election by 5. Then she went on in 2018 to lose the seat, and then ran again just now and lost it again. So here's how I would answer the question, do you support an increase in the minimum wage, putting the 6 powers of persuasion together? And I'm going to, just to clarify, I'm going to find the common ground first. I'm going to identify the most vulnerable who are hurt by this bad policy. I'm going to frame it in terms of fairness and compassion. I'll tell a little story, and then I'm going to use these rhetorical devices. 2 in particular, I'm going to, instead of making declarative statements, people don't like to be told what to think. Better to instead of making declarative statements, put it in the form of a rhetorical question, because when people are asked a question, then they own the answer. So I'll be using rhetorical questions, and I'll also be using the other rhetorical device, I worry about. And that's, I recommend doing that because it shows that you care right off the bat. I'm worried about. And then it allows you to pivot to your persuasive argument. So here's how I would do it. Of course, I believe in a livable wage. I just worry about the most vulnerable in our society, young minorities. And if they can't get a job at $10 an hour, how will they ever get a job at $15 an hour? And if they can't get their hand on that lowest rung of the opportunity ladder, how are they ever going to climb it to a living wage? And that's not fair. And there you see, I put all 6 powers of persuasion together. So here's why persuasion matters on this particular issue. The Business Insider did a poll last summer, a year ago, that showed that before learning that people lose their jobs, the minimum wage increase actually garners widespread support among Americans, almost 2/3. But after learning that people lose their jobs, it goes down to 37%. So persuasion matters. On the issue of the repeal and replace of Obamacare, here's a tracking poll from the Pew Research Center that shows that the sentiment of Americans regarding whether it's the responsibility of the federal government to ensure healthcare coverage. And you can see that after Obamacare passed, and up until the 2012 election, Republicans were making the argument about how it was hurting people and winning elections at all levels of government, really until 2016. But then what happened in 2017 is they stopped making the argument once they had control of all levels of government. And so in 2017, when they had the opportunity to pass it, instead of making a persuasive case to garner the support necessary for elected officials to take tough votes, they were talking about parliamentary procedures. And it was so frustrating to me. I had the opportunity to share it with my congressman, Scott Tipton, and he shared it with Kathy McMorris Rogers, who was the then Republican caucus, I forget her title, the number 4 person in the House of Representatives. And she had what's called a messaging advisory group. And she brought me into, later in that fall, they started working on tax reform. So I actually advised on how to message tax reform after I was complaining about Obamacare to my congressman. So here's what happened in 2018, though, on the issue of pre-existing conditions. Republicans struggled to respond to this kind of messaging. So I had the opportunity to work with Kathy McMorris Rogers in her campaign in 2018. In September of 2018, in her district, which is Spokane, Washington, essentially, she was polling within the margin of error, having won that district handily up until that point. And all Republicans had problems with this messaging, including in this last election. I think it really hurt Cory Gardner in my state. And most politicians, when they responded to it, it was always starting with what they were for, the policies that they were for, the bills that they had their name on. It was what. And Kathy McMorris Rogers really did a good job in her first debate. We taught her how to start with why. You'll learn a little more about why, the Simon Sinek idea, start with why, in a moment. But what she said was, when challenged by her opponent in the first debate, instead of coming out with all the policies and the bills and everything that she supported, all the whats, she came out and she said, I take offense at the suggestion that I don't support pre-existing conditions. My son was born with a pre-existing condition. Her son has Down syndrome. And I have worked my entire congressional career to assure that all Americans have access to high quality, affordable healthcare. And right now they don't, and that's not fair. And then her time was up and she never even had to talk about what she was for. And the truth is, she had voted for some of those bills that passed after 2010 that never went anywhere, that didn't assure pre-existing conditions would be covered. And I know that your organization has taken a stance on, and I've read some of the material, the whole idea of pre-existing condition, ensuring it is a, what's the word? It's like it's an impossibility. I mean, you can't insure pre-existing conditions. It's like insuring yourself after you've had a car accident, but we have to have a response to it because we're getting killed. And then finally here on this issue of polling, millennials actually, 52% of millennials would prefer either socialism, that's 46%, or communism, 6%. So it's one of the reasons why, because all these ideas that you guys are trying to deal with, the policies are more statist ideas. They're not necessarily socialist, but socialist ideas is basically statism. I want to just take a moment and talk about how to reject socialist ideas. And this is based on a presentation that I did when I was on a panel with Scott Rasmussen, the pollster. And yes, millennials and Gen Z, they do favor socialism much more, but they have a different understanding of socialism, according to him. They think it's sort of like equality, like in our Declaration of Independence. And in some cases, they conflate it with social media, like it's socializing, which just goes to this idea of the poor civics education that our kids have been getting. But on this, just to address this briefly, the whole socialism sounds so good thing. Thomas Sowell, I thought, had it down when he said the strongest argument for socialism is that it sounds so good. And the strongest argument against socialism is that it doesn't work. And so our goal has to be to make all these statist ideas sound bad because they hurt people, and all the good ideas, whether we call it, I don't call it capitalism because that word has been sullied. I call it economic freedom, but whatever, I'll use capitalism right now with you all, that those ideas are actually good ideas because they help people. And here's a good depiction of it. Satellite view of the Korean Peninsula shows you North Korea is dark and dead and the South is alive and alight. And that's because capitalism is based on the idea that if you help others in return, others will help you, in contrast to socialism, where government does everything for everybody, so you never have to help anyone. What kind of society is that? That millennials would want to live in that kind of society? I don't think so. And then this idea that actually profit, which is another word that has been sullied, and you hear it all the time in regard to healthcare, hospitals making profits and drug companies making profits, and like that's a bad thing. But in fact, profit is someone else's happiness. And here's a depiction of that. A photo of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who opposes capitalism. And here you can see she's wearing a Movado watch, holding a Starbucks coffee, and using her iPhone, all things she bought from corporations that made a profit off of her purchases that no doubt made her happy. And here is a meme that, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they all both rose to prominence on a fairness appeal. The system is rigged, as she says. And here he would say a handful of rich people should not run the country. But we can come back and invoke Americanism and this idea of separation of powers, which prevents tyranny, and say, but a handful of politicians should run the country. This is a good why. I agree. A handful of rich people should not run the country, but a handful of politicians should. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what Robert Cialdini, who wrote the book Influence, talking about the hows of persuasion, how to build rapport and trust in order to get people to like you. And he called it persuasion. So who are the persuadables and how to reach them? Before we're actually going to get into these 6 powers of persuasion, let's talk briefly about that. So they're the people, I call them the skeptical, with whom we must connect. They're young people who've been saddled with government debt. They're the ones whose premiums have skyrocketed because of Obamacare. They're the ones who were worse affected when the economy wasn't doing well under Obama. They were best helped when the economy started to roar until the lockdown started, and now they're struggling again. Minorities, same thing. They had stagnant wages for many years until the economic boom, until COVID. They had remarkably low unemployment, and wages were going up. And for them, with wages stagnating, it's unfair because they have to spread their limited disposable income across all the necessities of life. And then, of course, women's real concerns about healthcare were conflated with this phony war on women and really abortion, where they talk about abortion as as women's healthcare. So here's a grid. It's a voter ID grid in contrast to the usual left-right spectrum. I love to use this. I could talk a lot about this, but I'm going to focus on this for you all. It was developed by Alex Castellanos, who's a Republican consultant and used by this program here in Colorado called the Leadership Program of the Rockies. That's where I got it. So you have here on the left the equal outcomes crowd. They're the social justice warriors. I've got Ocasio-Cortez's picture there. And they're the ones, as Margaret Thatcher put it, they would rather the poor were poorer so long as the rich were less rich. And thankfully, they are a small minority, less than 10%. They are also, as I said before, not convertible. They're the hostiles. But you can power them down, and that has utility when you're in the presence of persuadables who see you as more thoughtful in contrast to the hostility of the hostile. So then to the right here, you have these 4 other categories, and you can approach people, especially in primaries. Republicans can try to appeal on the economy, law and order, and higher power basis. But here's what happens when we make arguments like that. They get misconstrued, like that millennial at the beginning, who says, well, we can't afford Obamacare, therefore we don't want to insure the uninsured. And we're opposed to sanctuary cities, therefore we want to deport Hispanic grandmas. And then, of course, we want to take away women's reproductive rights. So it's not to say that we can't make these arguments, but we should do it more in a fair and care way. And you'll see on the next slide, especially why that is. But you can see here on this slide that the largest plurality of voters are fair and care. I actually was told I'm fair and care. I always thought I was like a hardened, they say if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you don't have a heart. When you're not a conservative when you're 40, you don't have a brain. I guess I never had a heart. But anyway, so facts for these people are uncaring. It's why I said at the beginning, being the smartest person in the world isn't going to help you change many minds. And so it's why, one of the reasons why I think Trump is effective at making fair and care type arguments. He says that he's for free trade, but it has to be fair trade. He says it's unfair that people here illegally have their interests put before everyone else. NATO countries have to pay their fair share. The one-sided Iran deal is unfair. And so here's why that resonates for everyone. This is based on the book written by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind and His Moral Foundation Framework. This is the slide that was in Arthur Brooks's presentation. And Jonathan Haidt posited that there were 5 moral foundations on which people see society and look at policies. And you could actually go on his website, yourmorals.org, and take a test. It's a short survey, and find out where you rate on this morality spectrum. But I'll just tell you the punchline is that conservatives have a tendency to care about all 5 of these moral foundations about equally, where liberals are off the charts in terms of compassion and fairness. But you see here in the Venn diagram that all people can be appealed to on the basis of compassion and fairness. But really, it's only conservatives that were annoyed with Miley Cyrus twerking, or that recent Netflix movie Cuties, or with the children coming across the border, or Kaepernick not standing for the national anthem, Obama not wearing a flag on his lapel. Only conservatives really cared about that, not so much liberals. Now, you can see here that money is not in the Venn diagram at all, because it's not a moral foundation. It has no moral salience. And yet we have a tendency to make so many of our arguments about money. It's not to say that you can't, but you have to frame it in terms of fairness and compassion. So, for example, on the issue of unsustainable entitlements, instead of railing against them, we can argue it's unfair that young people paying into the system now won't get their benefits when they retire. Big difference between just railing against entitlements and not being able to afford it. Okay, so here I'm going to play this real quickly from that as an outtake from Arthur Brooks.
Everybody understands that hurting poor people is wrong. That's the basic principle, moral principle of compassion toward the weak. Number 2 is fairness. Conservatives hate fairness. St. Milton Friedman said that it's not right to never talk about fairness because it's a subjectively defined concept. Milton Friedman was a genius and I'm not. But that's not good advice. Why? Because John Haidt shows us that 100% of the population cares about fairness. We are wired to care about fair play. Now, we define it differently than President Obama. What's fairness for President Obama? It's taking from rich people and giving it to others. It's taking from one and giving it to others. It's redistribution. What do 89% of Americans think fairness is? Rewarding hard work and personal responsibility and creating opportunity. I have the facts. I got the data on that. Your definition of fairness is America's definition of fairness. The reason that we've lost the fairness debate is because we never showed up. We gave fairness to Obama. 100% of Americans care about it. We left the most lethal rhetorical weapon sitting on the table in the 2012 election. Sitting on the table. We should have said, we have a fairness crisis in America. We should have attacked on fairness. That was his weak point. He completely cowed the right into not talking about it by talking about it first. Those millionaires and billionaires, they need to pay their fair share. How many times did you hear that? Like 1 billion times you heard that, right? That's what he was doing, is neutralizing the mainstream meritocratic understanding of fairness. 100% of Americans care about fairness. You want to make the moral case? You better do it because you're fighting for people, and you better fight for people or you're going to waste your 7 seconds. The 2 things you got to talk about are compassion for the vulnerable and fairness for all. Those are the 2. Now,
all right, so that's where you get power persuasion number 3 and number 4. So again, now as we're going to go into talking about these 6 powers of persuasion, I want to be sure that as you approach the point of persuading, trying to persuade or engage a persuadable, that you're going to make a concerted effort to go beyond the choir. And to go beyond just the talking points that resonate only with people in our tribe, and that you're really interested in understanding their concerns so that you can validate them. I love this definition of Blaise Pascal. He's a French philosopher of the Enlightenment. And he said, people are generally better persuaded by the reasons which they have themselves discovered than by those which have come into their mind from others, I think is what the translation should be. And that insight is really, I think, it goes to what Simon Sinek's insight was, is that the most compelling speakers, they are able to articulate what other people believe, because people follow people who believe what they believe. And so as he points out in his TED Talk, if you've not seen it, I think you should see it. It's one of the most viewed TED Talks ever. And he talks about how the most compelling, inspirational speakers, they all speak exactly the same way, and it's the opposite of everyone else. They start with why they believe what they believe, not what they believe. And he talks about Apple and how they have a very compelling why, think different, that people are attracted to this movement, to be part of a movement that celebrates technology, that's easy to use and elegantly designed. And it doesn't really matter which one of the devices it is. People just, something new comes out and people want to be part of the Apple movement. It's not a surprise that it's the most valuable company in the world now, in contrast to Dell, which talks about it, what it does, but rarely, you wouldn't be able to guess what its why is. And he also, just a moment before I talk about Martin Luther King, here is the paradigm that we recommend when trying to make a persuasive argument. Start with why. If you have time, you should definitely make your argument, identify the vulnerable for whom you're fighting. So the why and the who. And if you have time, get to the how, but avoid the what, the result of the process, as Kathy McMorris Rogers learned. Now, his other big why example in his TED Talk is Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King had a dream so iconic, I don't even have to tell you what it is. He didn't have a 5-point plan. And it was so powerful that people followed him because they believed fundamentally, as he did, that man-made law had to comport with natural law, as was in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, which I believe is probably the most powerful, consequential why in human history, because it empowered the revolutionaries, the Americans, to create the most consequential country in human history, and not just consequential, but where the people have prospered the most. And so, not that everything was perfect. That's why 100 years later, Abraham Lincoln had to recast that why as government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, in order to save the Union and the Republic and abolish slavery. And then, of course, 100 years later, you had Martin Luther King and his basically cashing that check that was issued in the revolution, that all men are created equal. So here's some examples of whys from Trump's last State of the Union. His State of the Unions have been great and always filled with people-oriented whys. So just a couple here having to do with healthcare. A good life for American families also requires the most affordable, innovative, and high-quality healthcare system on earth. Who's going to disagree with that? The American patient should never be blindsided by medical bills. I know you're a doctor and you're thinking that's not practical, but we can talk more about that. Here's, who's going to disagree with Black Lives Matter, at least those words that Black Lives Matter, not the organization. So here, I normally like to try to practice this, but I'm just going to teach it for now. Here's how to come up with a why, a couple ways to come up with a why. We need to do something so that, because, in order that blank. And that second blank is the why. So you see a couple examples here. We need price transparency and truth in advertising in order, and here's the why, to protect the sick from surprise medical bills. We need to assure health insurance portability, and here's the why, so Americans stay insured even after losing a job. And then another way to look at a why is what's at stake if we do or do not do this. I want to protect the sick without burdening the healthy. I worry about COVID's politicization, as people believe only that which confirms their bias, undermining rational decision-making and endangering lives. And so hopefully, as I mentioned at the very, very start, I hope you guys are thinking of some of the vexing issues or questions that you would like to workshop next Thursday. Write them down in the Q&A. Jeremy can actually interrupt me and we can discuss them if you want, or I'll work on them between now and next week, and we can address them next week in the practice session. So now the 6 powers of persuasion, we're going to go through that and end with a little video of an example. So the 6 powers of persuasion, I presented them already. You have the handout. Now I'm going to tell you my story that puts it all together. It's an Obamacare story. And stories, as I say here, they're memorable and irrefutable. And you'll hopefully remember this as a good example that will help cement the 6 powers. So here it is. It was the spring of 2014. I was at a lunch celebrating someone's birthday, and sitting across from a woman, and she happened to say that she liked Obamacare. And I had to stifle my 2010 self, the one that wrote those op-eds before the 2010 election about how insurance rates wouldn't go down, they'd go up, that people would lose their insurance, their doctor, Sarah Palin wasn't exactly right that there'd be death panels, but there would be rationing. And I stifled myself. And instead of telling her all those facts, I stifled myself and I asked a clarifying question to kind of earn her trust, to really understand what was her concern so I could validate it. Well, she said, I like the fact that my son can stay on my insurance policy until he's 26. So I'll tell you, I happen to disagree with that, but I wasn't about to say that because my 80% friend isn't my 20% foe. So I said, you know what? I don't blame you one bit, because it's hard enough for kids coming out of college to get a good job right now, never mind a good job with good healthcare benefits. And then my pivot using I worry. And I said, you know, I just worry about the people who are in the healthcare system now, whose lives are getting completely upended by all of these changes. And here's my story. I was in the healthcare system last year. I had cancer. And in October of 2013, when the Obamacare website was going live, I was in the waiting room at Sloan Kettering with other patients who were finding out at that very moment that not only had they lost their health insurance, but they'd lost access to the very healthcare institutions and doctors that were keeping them alive. And that's not fair. And this virtue signaling woman sat back. You could tell she was thinking, gee, I thought I was the compassionate one. And all she could say was, gee, I guess you can't trust everything that politicians tell you, which is exactly what I wanted to hear. It was a victory for me, because one of the points I try to make is that ordinary citizens like you and me, that, you know, we are a self-governing society. We're founded on this idea of the democratic self-rule of a free people. And it's up to us to persuade one another, and that I could maybe get her on first base. I always hasten to tell people, don't expect to hit the home run right out of the box, that if you just get someone on first base, someone else can maybe get them to second. But just to get her to check her premise was a big deal for me. I like to use as an example Charles Krauthammer. I heard him speak about his evolution from being the speechwriter to Walter Mondale to becoming a conservative icon. Something got him on first base, suffice it to say. Okay, so you are the message is the first power of persuasion. It's this idea that in in-person communication, 50 to 90% of it is actually nonverbal. So you can make people like you or not like you based on your body language, your facial expression. Once you start talking, the tone and pace of your speaking voice. Suffice it to say, you want to use I hear you body language. For example, smile. I tested this on the streets of New York that fall. I was in New York, smiling at New Yorkers. Even on the streets of New York, they would smile back at me. And that's because you guys are doctors, you know this better than me. When you smile at someone else, you trigger a chemical reaction in the brain that induces that other person to smile back at you, usually, and incline them toward liking you. Eye contact, very important. People, if you're looking at, when you're talking to someone and you're looking at them in the eye, they're feeling heard. Head nods are affirming that they think you're agreeing with them. Open posture, in other words, this idea that the top of your head is like tied to the ceiling, is shown. In fact, there's a TED talk about it, that people who have that kind of posture are viewed as more confident and more competent. And then, of course, connecting gestures like this photo. I hasten to add that in the post-Me Too era, that men should be a little careful not to come across too much like Bill Clinton. Suffice it to say, no contemptuous body language, no rolling of the eyes, crossed arms, pursed lips, finger pointing, no furrowed brow. Okay, so second power of persuasion is the power of inhabiting common ground. Unlike Karen Handel, who said, this is the difference between liberals and conservatives, we want to appeal to everybody. So we want to start out either with a why, or we can come out and say, as Stephen Covey would recommend, identify what's right with what the person said, not just what's wrong. Or you can be an engaged listener and ask a clarifying question like I did in my example. What do you like about Obamacare? So that I could validate her concern by commenting agreeably. So here's one of Covey's habits of highly effective people. Seek first to understand and then next be understood. If you do it in that order, you will be understood, or you will have a better shot at being understood. And then, of course, this idea, his idea of beginning with the end in mind, it's also Maya Angelou's idea that she said so well when she said, people will forget what you said or did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So be amenable, not adversarial, gracious, not argumentative, thoughtful, not forceful, and grease things with positivity. In my example, I said, I don't blame you for wanting your kid on your insurance policy. And then this idea that we all want a more perfect union. On my handout where I'm powering down the hostels, this handout, I use this a lot, this idea, and that just to remind people that I also want a better world, a better society, a better country. I just may have different, can you just grant me that I have different ways of going about it? Because the assumption is that we just don't care. And this is one of the best ways to overturn that assumption. And I also like to suggest from our standpoint, looking at other people with whom we disagree, if Abraham Lincoln could stand before an audience in delivering his second inaugural address that included people who still believed in slavery and say, with malice toward none, with charity for all, we can do the same thing. We can show the same grace with people with whom we disagree. So here, I think maybe we'll save this for next week. I wanted to practice finding the common ground on these two issues, Medicare for all. So, these are the assertions that you hear. Medicare for all will bring down healthcare costs, improving access. The other one, we must lock down the country to save lives from COVID. So how could we find the common ground, either by starting with the why? You could come back and say, for example, I want to bring down healthcare costs and improve access. And I worry about a one-size-fits-all healthcare plan that won't meet the needs of everyone. Something like that. You sound reasonable and thoughtful, and that you're worried about people. On the one, we must lock down the country to save lives. Of course, I want to save lives from COVID, as well as lives from people, as well as the lives of those hurt by COVID lockdowns. Those are examples of whys. And we could talk about finding what's right or asking a clarifying question. We can, and maybe you guys can write this down and we can discuss this next week when we workshop this. I forgot to say this at the beginning, but I learned this the hard way. I broke my collarbone. And when I got back to playing tennis, it was on the left side. I got back to playing tennis a couple months ago, and I realized I couldn't use my two-handed backhand, and I started learning the slice backhand. And I realized just because I was taught how to use the slice backhand doesn't mean that I knew how to do a slice backhand. And I needed to be coached, and I needed to practice. And that's really what next week is about. And so here's another one we can talk about. In opposing the World Health Organization, find the common ground in responding to Nancy Pelosi's assertion that the president is crippling the international effort to defeat the virus. We could say, of course, we want a concerted, well-equipped, honest international effort to defeat the virus. And I worry that the World Health Organization undermined that effort and hurt people when they said that the Chinese had COVID in hand, for example. Okay, third power, persuasion. Identify the vulnerable hurt by bad policies and the vulnerable helped by good policies, and fight for them. We've been talking about this. It's that idea of Thomas Sowell that socialism sounds so good, but it's really bad. We need to describe that, how it hurts people. and then how good policies help people. This is another outtake from Arthur Brooks. I'm not going to play it. The bottom line is the winning side always fights for people. Democrats fight for people and fairness. Look at how they name their bills. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act doesn't do any of those things, but they got away with it. Medicare for all, the Dreamers Act, all the Equality Act, the Heroes Act, the CARES Act. What do Republicans call their bills? The most consequential bill of the Trump era was Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, fighting for things always. Here they said it in July, House Democrats are fighting for the people. That will never change. And the winning side always fights for people came through in 2016. Trump went up to the northern Midwest to speak to people, to campaign there, and won those states because he talked about the forgotten men would be forgotten no longer. Those very people Hillary referred to as deplorable Americans. And even in this last election, you saw a lot of Hispanics on the borders of Mexico and in Florida for the first time voting Republican because they felt that the Democrats were leaving them behind with these lockdowns and with, oil and gas limitations, that they would lose their jobs. And they saw that there's a suggestion that Republicans are becoming a multiracial party of the middle class. We'll see. I love this response to this assertion. This is Matt Taibbi. He writes for Rolling Stone, and he was in a Twitter exchange with this guy who said about the rioting and the looting. He was like, "It's just stuff, Matt. That's what insurance is for. The pearl clutching over property, is ridiculous." And he responds by saying, and we can say this in response to, take these words and apply it to almost anything in the healthcare field. That's not what insurance is for. You're putting innocent people out of work for weeks or months while damage is repaired, and then their rates go up forever. That's taking money straight from the pockets of people who've done nothing. Fighting for people and framing it in terms of fairness. Really good job. I'm not going to go through this list, but you see, you know better than I, the victims of Obamacare, that employers limited part-time work and then limited the number of employees, et cetera. But I do want to mention this energy poor thing. I had a chance to spend an hour with a candidate that was running for Colorado governor, Republican, and I asked him, he became the nominee, which is one of the reasons why Jared Polis is now our governor. So I asked him, so who's hurt by Jared Polis's policy to have fracking bans and 100% renewable mandates by 2030? And he said, oil and gas companies. I'm like, this is a typical Republican response to, fight for business. And I said, really, Walker, who's hurt most when energy prices go up artificially? Not only does the price at the pump go up, but everything in the economy goes up in price. And who's hurt the most? The people who can least afford it, whose limited disposable income gets spread across the necessities of life. So you might have some people who are have to choose between putting protein on the dinner plate or heating the house, and that's not fair. So again, we could practice who are the vulnerable who are fighting for Medicaid for all is going to hurt people who will lose their private health insurance that they like, or who's hurt by lockdowns. Well, what about all these people who are deferring diagnostic tests or cancer treatments, or young people locked out of school and on distance learning, whose social and academic development is being arrested, or the drug abusers who are being created or dying? These are the vulnerable people that we're fighting for when we were opposing these policies. Again, the World Health Organization, how many people died unnecessarily because the World Health Organization didn't do their job? Okay, fairness and compassion frame. Again, you saw how we reach everyone when we speak in terms of fairness and compassion. So again, we could talk about what's unfair or uncompassionate about these policies. Again, this is something we can do next week on these issues as well as others. you know, what was unfair about the World Health Organization basically protecting China, I think, or uncompassionate. You can write that argument writes itself. Okay, power of persuasion number 5 is the power of story. We've talked about how stories are memorable and irrefutable. Hopefully you remember my Obamacare story. And that's because they convey emotion. It helps make a connection and you build credibility. Trump and Reagan and other presidents have used very compelling stories of ordinary people, perfect for TV, human drama, to win the favor of Americans. His State of the Union speeches have all been very highly regarded, very high favorability ratings. And I was quite impressed with the Republican National Convention and how many, instead of using politicians one after the other, just talking heads coming up, they had ordinary Americans talking about how good policies help them and how getting rid of bad policies help them. Somebody actually asked me if I was advising the RNC because that's what they did. Unfortunately, they got there on their own. So here, I know this is a difficult picture to look at. It's a photo of a 3-year-old Syrian boy who fled Syria with his family, boat capsized on its way to Europe, and he washed up on a Turkish beach in September of 2015. And this photo proves what Stalin said, which is that one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. I know I'm running out of time here, so I've got to get going. So here, stories stimulate the human heart. And
please take your time, Melanie, where this is really important, and people are, you can't see the comments, but people are loving, really appreciate this presentation. So please don't rush through it if you have time to.
I'm almost done.
Time on it. Okay.
I'm almost done. Yeah. So one of the things I want you to think about is what are the stories that you could tell to illustrate the position that you're taking. And I would think that as doctors, you would have a lot. I'm going to show you a video in a moment of Chris Jacobs, we'll get there, and his attempt to answer the question, what's wrong with single payer healthcare, and how he could, well, I don't want to preempt that. We'll get there, but no doubt you have some good stories. What could you come up with to illustrate your position, bearing in mind that whatever story you tell, you have to tailor it to your audience accordingly. Okay, now the 6th power of persuasion is the power of pivoting to common ground. Again, this idea that Reagan said your 80% friend isn't your 20% foe. So these are the devices that I think I've demonstrated, almost all of them. Showing I worry is this device that shows you care while allowing you to pivot to your persuasive argument that's people focused. Asking questions, whether they're rhetorical or not, is very effective, making people own their answers. I have a slide on that in a moment. When you use the term imagine, as I said here in the 6th power of persuasion, you're asking people to imagine. You're basically replacing someone else's perspective with something better. So my example of that is when I wrote a column about the Baltimore rioting and what was going on there many years ago. I said that it was a miscarriage of justice. Instead of saying what everyone else was saying, which is that it's the fault of the Democrat-run cities and the mayor and the police, whatever. I said that it was a miscarriage of justice and the civil rights struggle of our time, that there were pockets of poverty in the richest country on earth, in which millions are deprived of the fulfillment and dignity of work. And imagine if we had other kinds of policies that could pull people out of these ugly lives. So I was asking people to imagine a different way of being. Now, FBI is not what you think. It's a tool for having productive confrontation. I actually learned this in a community listens class. It was something in my community started by a guy it's across the country now, but the guy felt that people in their workplace are told the one thing that they do wrong instead of the 9 things they do right. And then they take their frustrations home, and that reverberates throughout society. And he was trying to change that. And so he developed this 3-day course. I'm trying to teach this in 1 hour, 2 hours or whatever, but he developed this course, and one of the tools is this thing called FBI, and I've basically been demonstrating it. So you express a feeling and you identify an objective behavior, and then the impact of that objective behavior, or in the case of policy, the policy. So I've been using this example of, I worry that young minorities suffering high unemployment won't ever get on the social mobility ladder if the minimum wage is increased. So that's FBI. The first time I learned this, I came home and used it on my son, who I used to call a slob. This was like when he was 10. And the way I used it is I said, it's so frustrating for me, Zane, because I know how frustrating it is for you when your clothes are on the floor. You can't find things that are laying under them, and then you're late for school in the morning, and I know that frustrates you. And there was nothing he could say to that. Okay, so the power of questions. So questions are amazingly useful. They get other people talking. They show that you're interested in other people. They allow you to understand someone else's concerns so you can validate them. And they help people arrive at your point of view while feeling heard. So I've given some examples already. It helps people own their answers. If someone can't get a job at $10 an hour, how will they get it at how will they get a job at $15 an hour? The person answering that then owns that. Is access to a long waiting list really access to care? That's what single payer healthcare purports to give everyone the human right, or the right to free healthcare. But is access to a long waiting list really access to care? Question mark. Helps explore unconsidered facts. So if you're talking to somebody who thinks they know, and you'll see an example of this in a minute, would you be willing to look at other countries' record for healthcare access and outcomes? Because there are a lot of people who think the UK, other countries around the world, have better healthcare outcomes and access. But instead of saying, no, they don't, you just come back with a question. And it helps people gently explore unconsidered facts. And then this helps people check their premise. How did upending the entire healthcare system, causing people to incur higher premiums and even lose their insurance, help the most vulnerable who are in it? Which is kind of the point I was trying to make to the woman I was talking to. Okay, so here is, it's a little over 2 minutes. I'm going to play it because it is so powerful, and we're now almost at the end. So it's the power of asking questions. And you see how people own their answers. So this is a video that was shot by Campus Reform. They went just after Ocasio-Cortez came out with the Green New Deal, and they went to the University of Miami and asked students there what they thought of the Green New Deal. And without exception, and I've cut off the first part of this, but all the students say they're both progressive and they support the Green New Deal. There's just a couple here, and then you'll see Cabot Phillips then goes and asks them 3 questions about the Green New Deal, and then you can hear them check their premise until the very end, where they all they could come out of your families, they could be your kids, they sound like conservatives. So here, watch this.
Anything that would reduce our dependence on fossil fuels is really important.
I definitely support this movement.
Some of the things in the plan I want to get your opinion on. So the plan says within 10 years, we're going to completely outlaw coal, natural gas, and oil. So gasoline, anything like that in 10 years.
I don't agree with that. To be honest with you, I think we need those things to live.
I do not think it is feasible in 10 years. I don't think that would be something that would be able to be done in such a short amount of time.
I think 10 years is a little extreme because I feel like there's such a big global market and economic impact of oil businesses, albeit it might not be good for the environment, but you can't deny there's a big economic impact to these companies.
What's your thought on that?
Sounds like a reach, honestly.
Do you think that's feasible?
No.
If you're unwilling to work, we will still supply help for your salary and help for a living wage.
No, absolutely not.
If you're not willing to contribute to society, then I don't think that the people who are contributing should pay for you. So I disagree with that.
I feel like it kind of sends the poor message of, you can just get away with not doing anything and, getting money. It's kind of stupid.
I don't like that personally. Unwilling isn't the best way to go about things. Like, I don't want to go to college, but I have to get a job, so.
Everyone needs to contribute. That's the only way society works.
I don't know about that one. I think that if you're unwilling, that I don't know if you should receive money for that.
If you didn't want to go to class, if you were unwilling to go to class, should I still give you a good grade?
No. Yeah, like people definitely need a job and need to work.
Eliminating almost all air travel with high-speed rails. What's your thought on that?
I feel like it's kind of like the same one. I feel like 10 years is a little extreme for that.
I don't think it should be eliminated altogether. I think it's definitely, it can be an option. I think the more options we have, the better.
I think that's drastic. I haven't heard of that one yet.
Yeah, I can't see that happening either, honestly.
We've come so far to get to this point where we are right now with using these resources, and to say, we have to get rid of it in 10 years seems a little too much to me.
Who's going to pay for all of it? Who's going to offset the trillions of dollar cost that it would be?
Right. I don't know.
Okay.
Nobody knows.
Okay.
Like, it's kind of like, who's really going to pay? I don't, like...
Based on what you've heard from these, does it change your perception of the plan at all?
Yeah, a lot.
Sometimes you need to take extreme measures to save the environment, but I don't think that is I think it's a bit too extreme.
It doesn't sound like something I would be behind.
I don't agree with us having to, take away flying in the air. I don't agree with, taking away coal and things like that. And I don't agree with everyone getting money for doing nothing.
Okay, hopefully that's reassuring.
Anything that would...
And now I can't get your feedback on this, but maybe you'll write it. But I want to just show you, is it Chris Jacobs? I know he spoke to your group last year or a year ago. He was interviewed by Crystal Ball and her partner on this show. And this is the first question. And I'm curious to know what you think, based on what you've learned, what you think of his response.
We talk a lot about a Medicare for all on this show, and I know you have laid out some of the arguments against it. I would say, what are the top 3 reasons why you don't think it's the proper concern, while recognizing that the healthcare system in the country is terrible right now?
Sure, we do have problems with our healthcare system. I think $32 trillion in federal government spending when we already have $22 trillion in federal debt. The taxes needed to pay for that system. And then the poor quality of care. We've already seen it with the VA system, that veterans who survived wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, overseas, they couldn't survive their encounters with the VA bureaucracy that was manipulating waiting time targets for political purposes. That provides some indication that we would get under a single payer system.
I would really love to be able to pull out of you what you thought of that.
Yeah, Melanie, we're getting some answers. Like one person says it was focusing on money. Another one mentions here it didn't start with compassion or fairness.
How about the end, though? Talking about the VA and the politicization by government bureaucrats of who gets care. I think that's a pretty good argument. That's a fairness argument.
Yeah, the end was better. The end was better, people are saying in the chat room.
Yeah, good. Okay.
We talk a lot about a Medicare.
Now I just want to play this one last video, and then we'll end, and we can pick this up again next week.
Yeah, just another quick comment here. Someone said, good start on the VA, but he needed a story.
Yeah, exactly. Good. That's one of the things that I have another video from that interview. In fact, yeah, here it is. I don't know if you want to spend the time, you can see how she's got the stories and he doesn't. But let me just go back. I wasn't planning on playing that one unless you want to see it. But here, I thought this was a pretty effective message that Heritage came up with a year ago.
Well, what if we tried the completely opposite approach and put individuals and patients, also known as consumers, in the driver's seat? As opposed to the government deciding which medical and insurance providers get your tax dollars, you decide. Think about it. In industry after industry where businesses have to compete, what happens? Choices and innovation increase. Prices and other barriers to access come down. A similar approach needs to be taken in reforming our healthcare system. It won't happen overnight, but even a small step in the right direction shows the possibilities. 7 states that obtained waivers from Obamacare mandates, giving them the freedom to try new approaches, are now projecting higher enrollments in 2019 at significantly lower cost. 30% lower in Maryland, almost 20% in Alaska and Minnesota, and 15% in New Jersey. And all the approaches used to achieve these savings relied on tools that help those with pre-existing conditions get access to care. And that's just one example of what can happen when the operating philosophy is more choices and competition as opposed to one size fits all. Individuals and families have different needs and preferences when it comes to most things in life, including their health care. It's time our politicians respect their wishes and our laws allow more choice.
So that's an example of, it's kind of a stale think tank video, but I thought it was much better when I saw it. I thought, wow, they're really focusing on people instead of things. And I was presenting at the Heritage Foundation, so I used that. I will just play this really quickly. You'll see it's a 2-minute outtake from that same interview, and you can see how I think Chris got better, but she always comes back with an anecdote or like a quick example of, the drug companies make billions off of opioid addiction.
I think the real question that people have, and part of why Medicare for All is so popular, not just with Democrats, but really with Republicans and independents as well, is that we look around the world and we see every other developed country in the world providing their citizens health care as a right, with lower costs and in many cases better outcomes than we get here. And we say, why can't we do that too?
Well, first of all, there's nothing in Bernie Sanders' bill that actually makes healthcare a human right. You have the right to get your healthcare treatments reimbursed and paid for if you can find someone to take care of you. There is no guarantee in Bernie Sanders' bill that you will get treated by within X days or this procedure or have access to any of that. You see, in Great Britain, we have over 4 million people on waiting lists for procedures. In Canada, over 1 million people on waiting lists and procedures. Canada's Supreme Court, several years ago in 2005, actually nullified a provision in Quebec that abolished private health insurance because they said access to a waiting list is not access to care.
But I don't think anyone is saying those other systems are perfect, but are they better than ours? The outcomes would suggest that they are. And if you asked a Canadian, the guy who instituted their universal healthcare system, they voted him the best prime minister of all time. This is their favorite guy. They would never trade what they have for what we have.
I actually have it laid out in the book. Canada performs worse on a lot of access to care metrics than the United States. High waiting times in the ER, I think the highest.
But on health outcomes.
Yeah, I mean,
those are health outcomes.
I mean, look,
if you have to
our
wait
life
a day or
expectancy
two,
is dropping. So
if you have to wait a day or two to see a doctor, to see access to care, Canada's even on primary
we see
care.
Mortality rates actually falling in this country. I mean, you can't say that the system is amazing and great and we can't do anything better. That's why I think that there, like I said, is such support for a universal system, because we see other countries doing it and having healthcare that is better than ours. Why can't we, the greatest country on earth, do something that is even better than what Canada has?
So mortality rates, a lot of that is a function of the opioid crisis,
which was driven by big pharma's profit incentive.
Well, it was also driven by incentives that encourage people to overconsume opioids. So and encourage that. I wouldn't say that that's
government reimbursement of those costs.
And government reamburnment of
and doctors being feted by pharmaceutical companies who take them on golf outings.
It was an unvirtuous cycle, I guess.
Right, but the bottom line was that the Sacklers made $1 billion off of Oxy, and that's why we have the opioid crisis.
So we could talk more about this next week. I wanted to show that to you. I was going to save it for next week, but now you've seen it, and maybe think about coming back next week, and we can pick up with this, talking about what are better responses, what did he do right, what could he have done better, and if you want, I can send this to you, this video, Jeremy, so people can watch it again.
Sounds good.
Okay, so now I'm gonna close, and I know that we often feel beleaguered operating under this uncaring stereotype that I started out with, and fighting against people who think we don't care. But I hope that I have persuaded you that we inhabit the moral high ground. The truth is on our side, and so can public opinion be on our side if we approach people persuasively and winsomely, and engage to win style. And I want to leave you with this notion that Americans are the luckiest people to have ever walked this earth. And the concern that so many of us have, and probably the reason you're on this webcast, is because we are concerned that our children and their great-great-grandchildren won't be able to say the same thing. And that's our mission, that's our mandate. As I said before, we are founded on this idea of the democratic self-government of a free people. It's our job to propagate the best ideas. And as I said before, this morally superior formula for humanity. And I know for many, this last election probably was quite dispiriting. And hopefully you understand that it's not up to any one of us to finish the job or even do the job, nor should we desist from doing what we can. And so I hope I've given you some of the tools and the mindset to go out and propagate the ideas that will hopefully preserve for next generations the very system and way of life that we were lucky enough to have inherited from prior generations. And so to set you out on this mission, I want to close with the prayer I always close with, and it goes, help us remember the rich American past we have inherited, and keep us ever mindful of the bright American future we must secure and enrich. And may the memories of cherished leaders which guide our actions inspire us all to live lives worthy of remembrance. Thank you all for your attention. I'm so sorry I went over, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Hey, thank you so much, Melanie, for this very powerful talk. Really, really great information. Thank you so much for sharing this with us tonight.
Send your questions.
Yeah. So you can't, the chat room, you may not be able to see it, but people are very appreciative and are saying how much it's helping them, you know, with things they have coming up. You know, it's going very practical and helpful. And
well, we can talk about that and share that next week. You and I have to talk about how we do that with the group that we have, how we can facilitate that kind of interactivity on Zoom. But we discussed that briefly today. We'll do that.
I think next week maybe we will switch to a meeting format instead of a webinar with people, but we'll chat about that, you know, in the next day or so. But what'll work best there. And let's see, Dr. Orient, did you have any comments before we close out here? Do you want to?
Thank you, Melanie. This was wonderful. You all have some homework to do, especially maybe help Chris Jacobs, who really knows his stuff. He's up against this media personality, this actress. How could he do better?
Good question.
Very, very good question. And we'll be talking about that next week.
All right, super.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, so I just have a few closing announcements here real quick. And just really briefly here. And so just a quick reminder, in about 30 minutes, you'll be getting a follow-up email. And in that is, of course, as always, the link to the meeting evaluation to fill out so that you can get your CME certificate for this evening. And also in there will be a nudge for you to reply to the email to let us know the issues you'd like to see be a part of next week's persuasive messaging workshop. In other words, tell us the topic which is the most challenging or vexing, I think as Melanie put it, for you to discuss with others so we can consider it for inclusion next week. And with that, I think we'll say goodnight. Thank you again, Melanie, very, very much. Thank you to all our attendees for taking the time to be with us to learn tonight. I know I learned a lot, and I can tell you did too. And so thanks for taking the time to do that and for sharing your comments here in the chat room too. So in the next few days, we'll also share with you how we're going to facilitate next week's workshop, because at first I had thought maybe we do it via this webinar format, but I think maybe a meeting format will work better so we can all see each other and interact a little more freely. All right, well, with that, from all of us at APS, have a good night and good weekend. Thank you very much. Goodbye.